React server components. What are they? Why should you care? And when should you kind of keep using React client components? And when should you actually use these server components? Well, that's what we're going to discuss in this video. And React server components, there's something that have been promised by React for a while now. I think even backwards of a couple of years, the React developer team has kind of hinted at server components coming out. And now we finally have an implementation in which you can actually use React server components within a Next.js application. And if I were to guess, I would guess that these React server components are probably going to be rolled out to maybe some other React frameworks as well. Although it kind of seems as though Next.js is taking the lead on this a little bit. So with that, we're going to dive into that. But before we kind of get to React server components, I think it's important to understand kind of the client server model when it comes to web development. So here on the Next.js docs, and they actually have a great kind of rundown of these server components. And I definitely recommend that for kind of supplementary material here, but they kind of discuss the different rendering environments and how there are two environments where your application code can be rendered, the client and the server. So they kind of show this nice little graph here of the client over here on the left and then the server over here on the right. And they kind of mention that client refers to the browser on a user's device that sends a request to a server for your application code. It then turns the response from the server into an interface the user can actually interact with. And then the server is the computer or kind of data center that stores your application code. It receives requests from a client, does some computation, and sends back an appropriate response. So your client is what the user is going to be using. That was a little redundant, but that's going to be like your browser in a mobile application. It might also be the user's phone. It's going to be whatever they are interacting with, your user interface. And then that client, when it needs certain data or hits on certain URLs, it's going to make requests to the server, which a server is just going to be a computer that is going to serve up your application code or some data or different things like that. It's going to respond to the requests of the client. And it's just going to be this data transfer between the client, what your user is interacting with, and the server. All right. So now that we have an understanding of like this client server model, what are server components? Well, server components, they allow you to render your React components on the server over here rather than on the client. And in a classic React app, you would render all of your components on the client. You would basically get your div with an ID of root and inject all of your kind of components within your React app into that div with an ID of root, and you would kind of render out your application tree. But with server components, you can actually render your components on the server and then just send them to the client when they are requested, and they'll already be kind of rendered. So why should you care? What even is the benefit of this? Is it just because they're like this new fancy thing? Well, no, I think there are actually some like significant benefits of this kind of server component mental model. And for one, this would allow you to kind of render non-interactive components on the server while still rendering your interactive ones on the client. And the benefit of this, by rendering these non-interactive components on the server, you don't have to wait for the browser to render them. They are already rendered. So that's a potential performance optimization there, in which it can make your kind of application feel much more snappy and much more quick. Now, not only that, but there was a talk that one of the like developers of server components, Dan Abramov, mentioned is that one of the biggest benefits here is that it can allow you to kind of move your data fetching to the server. And then you can kind of co-locate that data fetching with your server components. So co-locating is like, okay, let's say you have a component that needs certain data from your database. Well, that component itself can make that request and just receive that data right there. And that data fetching in that component is all kind of located in the same place of your application. You don't have your data fetching occurring in one place and then it like filtering through to your components that need it. You can kind of have it all in one place. And personally, I really like that kind of architecture of an application, having your data fetching alongside your components and everything in that kind of same place. And the server components will automatically dedupe these requests, in which if you make the same request in multiple server components to go get like the same data, it's going to kind of dedupe that. It's not going to allow you to duplicate that request, and it's just going to return you the kind of cache data from that. So you can kind of move your data fetching to the server and co-locate that with your server components. Also, you can kind of keep your component model on your server. Like right now in our current application for my job, we have React as a front end and like Django and Django REST framework as a back end. And going back and forth between these two different like mental models of how Django works and how React works and stuff like that, like I would say I'm a front end focused developer, but maybe like 35% of my work is more kind of API backend stuff. So going between those mental models can be just take a second for me to kind of get the context of, okay, what the heck is going on in this Django app now? And if the front end and the back end just used like React components and it had this kind of very similar mental model, I think that would definitely increase development time. And I think that would be a better kind of developer experience for me personally. So that would definitely be a benefit. And then also you can keep more dependencies on the server. So if you have certain server components that they need to pull in like external libraries and different things like that, well, you can keep those dependencies on the server and you don't have to ship all those dependencies and all the code for those dependencies to the browser, to the front end. And one of the best ways to improve performance for your applications is to just ship less code to the browser, which is why we also have lazy loading and stuff like that. And one thing that I believe Dan Abramov also mentioned in one of his talks on server components is that server components will also kind of allow you to automatically code split your application. So it also allows you to kind of split your application into these chunks and not ship as much code to the browser kind of right away. And another benefit would also be you could also cache these server components. And since these are going to be like just more kind of static components, you don't really have to worry about doing like a lot of cache invalidation and kind of running into those tricky issues with caches that you might run into with kind of client side components and interactive components. So with these static server components, that can make doing something like that kind of much easier. And I think that in the Next.js docs, this kind of diagram really outlines what an application using both client and server components can look like. So they have this just like outline of a page here, and what's in purple is a server component or diagrammed as a server component. And then the blue would be a client component. So you can see like they have the sidebar, just a static sidebar is a server component. It's a non-interactive component. So that makes sense to just render on the server and then ship to the browser. The user isn't going to be interacting with it. So we don't need like the benefits of client side components of all that nice kind of fast interactivity. We can just have a server component there. Same thing with the nav bar. But you see, the search component within the nav bar is actually a client component because the user is going to be typing into this navigation bar. It's going to be searching different things. And we want like a nice response of that nav bar of this search component here and to provide good feedback to the user. So that's an interactive component. So a client component. And then here in like the main content, this looks like kind of like a news feed to where the content of that news feed is just server components. It's static content. But the different kind of buttons within this newsfeed to maybe like if you're going to like a post or you're going to subscribe to some user or you're going to comment or something like that, all of those could be client components because you're going to have this interactivity. So you can have these apps that potentially get the best of both worlds of having this client side interactivity, which is part of the reason that people started using React, is getting some of those nice kind of very fast interactions on the client. But you can also take a benefit of just rendering things on the server and improving your kind of performance and having some of those other benefits that I talked about earlier as well. So you could see using both of these in kind of the same sort of page here. So I think it would also be helpful to kind of think about, all right, well, when might you use server components versus client components? And I've kind of hit on this already, but client components, good use cases for these are going to be when you need to add any interactivity to a certain component, or you need to handle events. That's going to be helpful with client components. You need to kind of use state within a component. So using the use state or use reducer or Stand or Redux or whatever kind of state manager you're using, or you need to have certain effects, or you need to use browser only APIs. So if you're going to be using something like local storage or session storage or different things like that that are browser specific, you're going to have to use client components. But on the flip side, you would use server components when you need to fetch data and you can kind of co-locate those components to that data. You need to use different like backend libraries. You need to kind of keep sensitive data. So like environmental variables or different things like that. Those would all be good use cases for things to just have on the server components. And by default, I believe in the latest edition of Next.js, they kind of just have server components as a default component, and then you opt in to client components when you need to use like browser only APIs, some state, some interactivity and stuff like that. And they also have this nice chart here on when to use client versus server components. So you can see server component is going to be fetch data, accessing backend resources, keep sensitive information on the server, large dependencies, and you want to reduce client-side JavaScript. But then for your client components here, anytime you want to handle an event or you want to use state or effects, browser-only APIs, custom hooks, stuff like that. So hopefully this video gives you a good idea of what server components are, why you should care about them, how they're useful, the benefits of them, what problems they can solve, and when you might use client versus server components. I'm definitely going to have more videos on this. I haven't used Next.js much because of my professional job. I use Django and just React. So it's definitely something that I want to kind of start learning, as some of the stuff is just too cool kind of not to learn if you find this sort of cool. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in that next one.